So this covers the three courses that I teach, 3307C in biology, which is the climate change biology, BSc 2862, global change ecology and sustainability, and BSc 4055, climate change in human systems, which focuses on One Health of the planet. And this is the 2022 year-end review. Where we are today. Well, before the monitoring system at Mauna Loa shut down because of the volcano, the last reading that was posted was for December 28th, 2022. And you can see that it's 418 parts per million on a per mole basis per volume. And this is headed back up because we're entering the winter period of the Northern Hemisphere where there will be less green stuff removing the CO2 and more industrial processes adding CO2. As you can see from the chart on the right, the conferences of the parties, the United Nations conferences on climate change, the parties being the various nations of the planet Earth, have made no difference whatsoever. The first World Climate Conference was in 1979. And since then, you can see there's absolutely nothing that's happened. And the last two conferences, COP26, Conference of the Party number 26, and COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, have made similarly no difference or are projected to make no difference. In the meantime, new evidence on climate risk suggests that multiple climate tipping points could be triggered if global temperatures rise beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. Rapid mitigation is more urgent than ever, and as global temperatures rise, adaptive responses become less effective. This points out the big lie, what Greta Thunberg is called mitigation denial. We believe that we can mitigate and that we still have time to do so without really understanding the enormous amount of mitigation that would be required of us, and instead focusing on adaptive responses. Adaptive responses cannot supplant mitigation, and they become harder and harder the more we delay very significant shutdown of fossil fuel emissions. Cascading and compound impacts could give rise to catastrophic outcomes. And I think although there's reason to be optimistic, cautiously optimistic, it's really important that we acknowledge what these various outcomes could do. Global warming, sea level rise, extreme weather events, economic inequality, which is very bad now and likely to get worse, vector-borne disease, witness COVID-19, and there are many, many others, dengue and malaria, displacement, migration, both within boundaries of countries and across international boundaries, international and local conflict, all of these things increase, all leading to increased mortality and morbidity, state fragility, in which the government can no longer maintain the orderly function of the business of government. Biodiversity impacts. There's a belief that if we manage climate change, that biodiversity will fall in line automatically. That's just simply not true. We are doing much more damage to biodiversity than just from the climate system. Ecosystem services is what we rely on. And as these things fall apart in cascades and compounding impacts, we end up with food, fuel, and water shortages and overall resource scarcity. The approach to this is called integrated catastrophic assessments, and it was outlined in a recent paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy. And it points out that prudent risk management requires consideration of bad to worse scenarios. Yet for climate change, such potential futures are poorly understood, although present projections indicate that our current trajectory will warm the Earth by possibly less than 3 degrees C, and with globally coordinated strenuous efforts at emissions mitigation, which we're not doing, we could stay below 2 degrees C. The models used for these projections are integrated assessment models, or IAMs. And as I've covered in all of my courses, These have some flawed assumptions about the global economy, including inaccurate reporting on emissions by nations and the fossil fuel companies in particular. There are ample reasons to suspect that climate change could result in global catastrophe. At the same time, we can be cautiously optimistic. What did COP26 in Glasgow accomplish? Well, much less than was needed. A lot of side deals, pledges, and few measurable results to date. The financial side deal was major financing initiative from more than 450 organizations in the financial sector, including banks, fund managers, and insurance companies in 45 countries out of 170 some, to move US $130 trillion of funds under their control into investments where the recipient is committed to net zero emissions by 2050. No evidence of this is apparent at this point. I don't see any evidence in the literature or in the gray or peer-reviewed literature that this is being implemented. Deforestation, a new proclamation by only 133 nations, not the same as a consensus of the COP, agreed to halt global deforestation by 2030 and to try to restore degraded woodlands. Brazil and Indonesia signed on to this. And I would remind you that Bolsonaro was president of Brazil at the time. Many governments that joined the proclamation have failed on such commitments in the past. And between COP26 and COP27, deforestation has significantly increased, especially in Malaysia and Brazil. Fossil fuels. A global pledge in the final document by all nations to phase down the use of unabated coal, which means coal that doesn't employ carbon capture and sequestration, and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Definition of inefficient and unabated remained vague in the final document. This is the first time that fossil fuels have been addressed in the final documents of any of the COPs. Healthcare emissions. More than 40 countries pledged to reduce CO2 emissions from healthcare, 40 out of a very large number at the COP. The date not specified. This is one of those side deals. 12 countries pledged to be net zero from healthcare by 2050. The US, the UK, and Germany are included. Healthcare accounts for almost 5% of global CO2 emissions, and the US has by far the highest, almost by a factor of 10. There's new pledges that were made at the COP. Not all countries signed on, but this could put us at 1.9 degrees C. The new nationally determined contributions on the 18th of October, 2021, put us above 2. The new ones put us slightly below 2 at 1.9 degrees C. Again, as a year out, there's little evidence that these new NDCs are being implemented. The other side deal that was important was the climate finance pledges, mostly private financial institutions. The actors are corporate, institutional, infrastructure funds, private equity, and venture capital. Private equity, of course, being a mixed bag where it results in the demise of some major industries, commercial financial institutions, and households and individuals. Overall, 70% of this money would be private and 30% would be public between 2021 and 2025. The overall tally is a huge number, and it remains to be seen if this is actually going to occur. So what did COP27 in Egypt accomplish? Well, it was partly a step backward and a couple of steps forward. There was no agreement to phase out abated or unabated fossil fuels or to produce a schedule for doing so. Until COP26 last year, the COPs had failed to even mention fossil fuels as the cause of emissions. It created a fund for loss and damage, which has little money in it right now and no specifics on who pays, how much, and when. It has introduced significant recognition of the fundamental priority of safeguarding food security and ending hunger. hunger. And also safeguarding biodiversity and restoring ecosystems. These are words in the final document. There are no programs or funding indicated in the final document to accomplish these all-important tasks. It did produce an agreement to provide major funding for forest restoration. This is big. I think loss and damage fund having been created and the major funding for forest restoration both represent a huge window of opportunity for making progress. The forest restoration will have billions of dollars behind it in theory, and it's really important that this proceed as fast as possible. Well, who is responsible for loss and damage? These are the countries that have caused the most economic damage to the rest of the world through their emissions. This 2022 study calculates the economic damage caused by the top emitters. And the United States and China are right at the top of the list. Overall, the US, China, Russia, India, and Brazil have collectively caused 6 trillion in income losses from warming since 1990. That's overall 11% of the cumulative global GDP during that period. The funds for forests and loss of damage have been created, but at COP19 in 2013, the global North countries agreed that by 2020, they would be putting $100 billion a year into a fund for adaptation, mitigation, and left unsaid but implied losses. No one country has fulfilled this promise, and for years, the wealthy countries have blocked even having these conversations at the COPs. So the track record is not good. Several countries, including Scotland, Austria, Germany, Ireland, and Belgium, have now committed to their share of loss and damage at COP27, but the fund created by the final agreement has little money in it and no scheduled payments. The US blocked this fund until the absolute last minute and instead proposed a market-based approach that experts agree is open to gaming and greenwashing without stringent regulation and verification. The US has not enthusiastically endorsed this fund. It merely stopped blocking its creation. Egypt introduced text late on the last day to include low emissions energy sources. Most of the delegates voting on the final document did not even know this was in it. This is clearly a reference to fossil gas or methane. Presently, the number of official fossil fuel representatives at COP27 has expanded to 503 at COP26 to 636 at COP27. It's a point of view argues that this represents more geopolitical power than any single country on Earth. Meanwhile, ExxonMobil, Shell, and Total are pushing to expand drilling for gas and oil in the global south, arguing that it is only fair for these countries to accelerate their development using these resources. This is a specious argument. For the simple reason that it presumes that oil and gas are the only way that their development can be accelerated. The reality is that to date, very little of the income from those resources has actually transferred to the nations where extraction occurs. Overall, the outcomes of the Conference of the Parties have been repeated failures to address the central problem of fossil fuel emissions. And, drumroll please, the site of COP28 will be the showcase city of a petrostate in Dubai. This is so disappointing that it prompted George Monbiot on the 18th of November 2022 to state, this is the culmination of 50 years of deliberate engineered failure. The world's governments look like a death cult built around the demands of elderly billionaires. It's really hard to argue with his point when the site of the next major conference of the parties on climate change will be in Dubai. The 10 most important statements from assessment report number 6, working group 3. Working group 3 delivered its final report or its actual penultimate report in April of 2022. And here are 10 of the most important things that came out of the technical summary. The interactions among politics, economics, and power relationships are responsible for the lack of urgent action. Opposition from status quo interests and lack of low carbon financing are primary barriers to action. Climate science has been undermined by counter movements, media, and misinformation. Corporations are primary obstructionists to climate action. Future CO2 emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructure will result in overshooting 1.5 degrees C. This existing infrastructure must be decommissioned. We have to walk away from it. The wealthy top 10% of individuals globally are responsible for 36 to 45% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The G20, or the Global North, is responsible for 80% of historical emissions, and the G77, the Global South, has contributed little to radiative forcing. No country is currently doing enough or pledging enough. People need services that can be delivered without energy and materials derived from burning fossil fuels. The demand for fossil fuels is actually supply-driven, not demand-driven. Massive subsidies for fossil fuels worldwide must end immediately. And incremental change is unacceptable. It's that incremental change that you're seeing at the conferences of the parties. Only wholesale societal transformation will salvage a livable planet for the students that are in my classes now and the second half of their life, and for their children and descendants. The report explicitly suggests degrowth as an economic system. I'll talk about what degrowth is in just a minute. We need to reduce the resource consumption of the major industrial powers generally of the global north, and we need to increase the sustainable development of the global south. Developing nations need to leapfrog directly to being powered by renewable energy. This is very possible. The wealthy countries have the greatest responsibility for this demand management. Global domestic product drives growth because GDP demands growth, and thus emissions are directly driven by GDP, even though there's some evidence that a few countries are slowly decoupling their economy from GDP. This is a very minor impact. The bottom line is GDP should be abandoned because it doesn't measure well-being. An economic system of degrowth should be implemented. So what's the national responsibility for the ecological breakdown? Now, climate change is included in this. This is the calculation of excess materials use from population-based quantification of fair share of total material resources available. The high-income nations are responsible for 74% of the global excess material use, primarily driven by the US, 27%, and the EU, 25%. Excess material use is the immediate cause of habitat destruction, extinctions, and climate change. However, solving climate change for this dominant species, Homo sapiens, does not necessarily solve the destruction of biodiversity on the planet. It's that excess material use that is the prime driver of that. Scenarios that rely on bioenergy-based negative emissions technology appropriate land from the global south to support the global north's energy privilege. These are the median pathways of per capita energy use in the global north and the global south. And the difference in those pathways in per capita energy use is huge. There's an urgent need to develop scenarios that represent energy convergence to just and sustainable levels. Obviously, we need to talk about economics, so bear with me while I briefly review the standard model in neoliberal economics. First, what is neoliberalism? Is contemporarily used to refer to market-oriented reform policies such as implementing price controls, deregulating capital markets, lowering trade barriers, and reducing state influence in the economy, especially through privatization and austerity of the public. In theory, this permits free exchange of goods and services based on Adam Smith's proposition of rational self-interest. Laissez-faire economics is another term for this. It's a philosophy that minimizes the role of government intervention and taxation in the free markets and the notion that the invisible hand guides supply and demand. And those are the key ideas that are purported to come from Adam Smith's writing in 1776. These reflect the concept that each person, by looking out for him or herself, inadvertently helps to create the best outcome for all. We have enormous amounts of evidence that that is not true. So what is capitalism per se? Well, it's defined by, first, enclosure and artificial scarcity. Over the past 500 years, this has taken the form of privatization of the commons and forced dispossession. Secondly, capitalism is organized around and dependent upon perpetual expansion. If the GDP is not growing, then technically we're considered to be in a recession, and this is a bad thing. But frankly, perpetual GDP growth, beyond that necessary to support the population, is an absurd notion on a finite planet. Third, capitalism precludes democratic decision-making in the management of global resources and very frequently in the management of local and regional resources. Democratic principles are rarely allowed to operate with respect to the control of capital and resources. Money talks. We can have a democratic economy organized around meeting human needs at a high standard, where production is socially just and ecologically regenerative. My definitions come from Jason Hickel. The neoliberal model is the ultimate tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons was developed by Garrett Hardin in 1968 in an article in Science. Garrett Hardin is a despicable, avowed racist. And I think it's really important to point this out, even for people who've made major contributions. His argument is that a shared resource system where individual users acting independently according to their own self-interest behave contrary to the common good of all users by depleting or despoiling the shared resource through their collective action. This is direct opposition to the popular interpretation of Adam Smith's writings. John Maynard Keynes argued that the solution to depression was to stimulate the economy through a reduction in interest rates and an increase in government spending. Keynesian versus Smith economics remains the basis of much debate today. Economics has been frequently referred to in the literature as the dismal science. And this is because while natural and physical sciences have made great strides in the last 300 years, economics has not accepted the reality that we live on a limited planet and that our survival depends utterly on wise use of its resources. Current macroeconomic policies are mostly untethered to the reality imposed by the physical and natural sciences. This is the fairy tale: demand, supply, a resource market, goods and services, demand, supply, a product market, individuals, businesses, taxes, and the government. Notice how everything's a nice big circular array. Well, in this world, pigs can fly. The reality is this: human capital and produced capital and natural capital are all being interchanged, and it's the natural capital that's frequently left out of the equation, or in fact, almost is always left out of the standard economic model. Neoliberalism represents what I would refer to as institutionalized sociopathy. If we look at the share of total income or wealth, the wealth includes real property and added value, and 76% of that wealth has been sequestered by the top 10% of the population. Recently, there's been a huge surge in the very top tier. The average annual growth by percentile has been enormous. More and more global billionaires are walking onto the scene. In the meantime, this is one of many, many social injustices. This is the percent income per labor by women, At gender parity, we would be at 50%. And you can see that in various parts of the world, things are improving, but it's nowhere near approaching gender parity. And in China, it's actually gotten worse, which is really hard to explain. I'm not sure what's causing that. If we look at the tons of CO2 equivalents emitted per person, East Asia, almost 40%, Europe, almost 30%, North America, mainly the United States, 73%, South and Southeast Asia, 10%. So how do you measure well-being if you don't use GDP? Well, the history of GDP is a fluke. It's the measure of all goods and services per time, developed in 1934 and became the primary way of measuring wartime production, especially during World War II. In 1944, GDP was adopted globally. Well, there's what various indices can we use? Gross national well-being, gross national happiness, the Gini coefficient, which measures the disparity of the rich and the poor within a country and across the globe, the happiness index, the social progress index, the satisfaction with life index. Well, if you look at real GDP per capita over the United States, this comes from a 2020 study by the University of Michigan and Veenhoven. You see that average happiness really hasn't budged since 1965, and the index of consumer sentiment hasn't changed very much since 1965, while real GDP per capita has increased. That real GDP is driving emissions. Well, Kate Raworth was a graduate student at Oxford in economics, and she rebelled, as many, many other graduate students in economics are now rebelling. She said, this is wrong. This is not working. And she developed what she calls Doughnut economics. She says you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. She pointed out that not only are we exceeding the environmental ceiling in terms of biodiversity loss, climate change, reactive nitrogen and phosphorus dumped into the environment, ocean acidification, etc., but we haven't paid any attention to the social foundation that creates this safe and just space for humanity. This is water, income, education, resilience, voice, energy, jobs, social equity, gender equity, health, and food. She points out that building a sustainable civilization based on this social foundation is the only way forward that produces an acceptable outcome. And she argues, and I agree with her, that we have all the tools that we need and that the social foundation is essential. These are some of the obvious flaws in the fairy tale. The concept of the circular flow of labor, capital, goods, and services is the foundation of almost all economic models and drives the decisions of policymakers. It is an unexamined assumption held by most participants in the economy. In this absurdity, firms and households exchange work for wages, rent, and dividends. The money then flows back into those firms as spending on goods and services. Raworth identifies 4 flaws to this model, which dominates economic education. Ecological context. Our economy is embedded in the environment. Duh. We draw on the planet's resources like sun and water and turn them into pollution and waste. Parenting. Many hours go into helping our children, caring for our family, maintaining our households. All of them add to the economy, but aren't accounted for anywhere. Unpaid work. We're obligate social primates. Cooperation and reciprocity are part of our wiring. We must do things for others, even for free. Excuse me, let me get rid of this pop-up. I don't know why it's there. These free services add value too, but it is not considered in the standard circular economic model. Inequality. GDP growth is hailed as the holy grail all nations should strive for, But so far, it has failed to eliminate inequality and has widened the gap massively between the rich and the poor. GDP includes many things that undermine civilization, war, planet and planetary sustainability. Alternative number two has been around for a while. It's called the steady state economy. It was developed by Herman E. Daly. The steady state economy features relatively stable size. It is ideally established at a size that leaves room for nature and provides high levels of human well-being. Many would argue we've already exceeded that. The term typically refers to a national economy, but it can also be applied to a city, region, or the entire planet. The size of an economy is generally determined by multiplying the population by the amount that each person consumes. This quantity in a steady state economy neither grows nor contracts from year to year. Herman Daly was the founder. He died just a couple of months ago. He argues that it's an economy with constant stocks of people and artifacts, maintained at some desired sufficient levels by low rates of maintenance throughput, that is, by lowest feasible flows of matter and energy from the first stage of production to the last stage of consumption. So this is essentially a minimalist argument in many ways, and it's predicated upon constant stocks of people and artifacts rather than continuously increasing consumption. The principles are sustainable use of renewable resources. That means that the pace should not be faster than the rate at which they regenerate. And sustainable use of non-renewable resources means that the pace should not be faster than the rate at which their renewable substitutes can be put in place. Sustainable rate of emission for pollution and waste means that it should not be faster than the pace at which natural systems can absorb them, recycle them, or render them harmless. The characteristics of a steady state economy are often illustrated by this diagram, where we have solar energy and low-grade thermal energy entering and leaving the system respectively. We have continuously recycled materials. Waste assimilation and natural resources is the prime driver of the economic system. Stable population, stable per capita consumption, energy and material flows are reduced and kept within ecological limits, and constant stocks of natural and human-built capital. Well, there's a group that has a lot of information on a steady state economy. It's run by Brian Scheck. I encourage you to check it out. The Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. Brian asked the incoming Obama financial team at a major conference at the Reagan Center just before the Obama administration came on board if they plan to use any principles of a steady state economy, and they were utterly baffled. They had no idea what he was talking about. Alternative number three is what appeared in Working Group 3's technical summary report in at least a couple of different places, and this is degrowth. Jason Hickel at University of Barcelona is one of its primary proponents. He has just received a multi-million euro grant from the European Union to develop this further, along with many collaborators internationally in Europe and in the UK. Degrowth is planned reduction of energy and resource use designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. It focuses on reducing material throughput and thus energy demand. It's ecologically coherent. Reducing material throughput not only helps us to address climate change, but also removes pressure on other planetary boundaries. This is very reminiscent of a steady state economy because Herman Daly also emphasized reducing the rate of throughput. Degrowth is not, however, about reducing GDP, but rather about reducing that throughput. Reducing throughput will decrease the rate of GDP growth. If overall GDP decreases with reduced throughput, which it certainly would, this should be managed for the well-being of all. Social democracy is the only way forward here. Degrowth is not a recession. Degrowth is planned, coherent policy to reduce ecological impact, reduce inequality, and improve well-being. Recessions are not planned, and they result in austerity. Degrowth is a discriminating approach to reducing economic activity. It seeks to scale down ecologically destructive and socially irrelevant production, for example, planned obsolescence in material goods, while expanding socially important sectors like healthcare, education, and collaborative management of resources. This is not the first time that these alternatives have been thought about. In 1972, Donella Meadows and her colleagues wrote The Limits to Growth. It was a report for the Club of Rome's project on the predicament of mankind, simply acknowledging that at some point we're going to run out of the Earth's resources, and it postulated as to how that might occur. The Limits to Growth was revisited after 30 years, and many of the projections from the original 1972 document have unfolded as predicted. A Prosperous Way Down, Principles and Policies, was written by Howard T. Odum and Elizabeth C. Odum. I had the enormous privilege of meeting Howard T. Odum before he passed away in the late 1990s. A Prosperous Way Down refers to, effectively, degrowth, using the principles that Odum had developed. And many of the young students in ecology today don't know it, but Howard T. and his brother were, in fact, some of the founders of the modern version of ecology in the United States. This has been carried on recently by Timothy Parric in France, and it's worth pointing out that degrowth as an economic system was developed by French economists in the 1970s. Degrowth introduces policies to prevent unemployment and improve employment by shortening the work week, I'm all in on that, job guarantee with a living wage, and ending sectors that are destructive of living systems. Seeks to reduce inequality and share national and global income more fairly, using progressive taxation and living wage policies. Degrowth seeks to expand universal public goods and services, the public trust, health, education, transportation, housing, and green space. Degrowth is part of a plan to achieve a transition to renewable energy and reverse ecological breakdown. So degrowth really puts traction or mechanism to a steady state economy. How this could play out remains to be seen, but I would submit to you that we have to try. In the meantime, I would argue that evolution has given us the solution to climate change. We are not born a blank slate. We're born with instinctual morality that is derived from our ancestors. Our two most closest ancestors are the chimpanzee, living ancestors that is, and bonobo. The chimpanzee is warlike, it's cannibalistic, it's very male dominated in a very hierarchical social structure. The bonobo, on the other hand, is a matriarchal society. It is peaceful. It is welcoming to outsiders. It is collaborative among its members. And we share the same amount of genetic material with both of these living close relatives. So here's a statement that I like a lot from Marcus in 2004. He says, the first draft of the moral mind is as follows. The initial organization of the brain does not rely that much on experience. Nature provides a first draft, which experience then revises. Built in does not mean unmalleable. It means organized in advance of experience. Matt Ridley put this in a buzz phrase, nature via nurture, rather than nature versus nurture. So evolved morality in humans has continuity with the other primates. Empathy and consolation, pro-social collaboration, reciprocity and fairness. We've all experienced these things. Plus, we've also experienced toxic in-group loyalty and submission in our response to authority. Now, all of these things have a evolved basis and are continuous with other primates. I'm suggesting that we need to exercise the muscle that gives us empathy, consolation, pro-social collaboration, reciprocity, and fairness, rather than continue to emphasize those characteristics that separate us. Here are some rules of engagement. We need each other. We are obligately social primates. If you think you can go it alone, good luck. We live in the shelter of each other, and this is not negotiable. Collectively, we are the most powerful and dangerous organism the earth has ever seen. Individually, we would be somebody's lunch on the African savannah or in the dog-eat-dog business world. Collaboration and reciprocity are required if civilization is to survive. Our collective wisdom will determine our success. Adaptation and mitigation must become the primary work of our time, and I call this the great work of our time. As a species, we are not inherently flawed or too stupid to change, but sociopathy is very, very real. We did what was expected of any intelligent social species. We found a rich source of energy buried deep in the earth in terms of carbon stores. We mined it and built a civilization. Some would argue a flawed civilization. Blaming ourselves or each other really isn't useful. We know how we got here. The question is, how do we get out? Humility must be a collective core value if civilization is to survive. We need to see ourselves as part of nature and not domineering of nature. Our standards for what constitutes a better life are individually selfish and not congruent with the flow of energy and materials on our planet, as pointed out by Herman Daly and in the Principles of Degrowth. I would also suggest that we need moral humility if we are to understand and be able to collaborate with people that disagree with us, the so-called outgroup. Collective action is the antidote of despair. There has been ample cause for despair in my courses because the situation looks pretty grim, frankly, and I can't pull my punches on that when I teach. But I do believe that we have all the tools we need as iterated by Kate Raworth. And collective action is the way to banish despair because you're doing something. And I would remind you that it doesn't matter what we think, it doesn't matter what we feel, it only matters what we do. Future generations will judge us by our actions, not by our intentions. We must collaborate and act. And we are not members of tribes, Black, Asian, Hispanic, white, US, UK, France, Spain, Russia. We are a global species, and we must act like it or face collapse. Tribalism has no place in building a sustainable future. We have to do this collectively. Be of service to something bigger than yourself. Service is part of our evolutionary wiring. It is deeply satisfying. You should engage in it. Participate collectively in the great work of our time, including the political process. Always, always vote. Nature is the ultimate source of spiritual renewal. Whenever I am at a loss or anxiety is consuming me, if I can, I retreat to nature. Even something as simple as looking up at the stars on a clear night can banish my self-centered fears. Preserve and manage ecosystems for form and function, even as they are disrupted and extinctions ensue. Cultivate a sense of awe, even for these ecosystems and for nature in its diminished form. If there is some place in nature where you receive comfort and inspiration, I advise you to go there as often as possible. Kate Raworth postulated a safe and just space for humanity. We can compare that to our individual attitudes. So if we have a highly egoic self-construct, for example, extreme individualism and even narcissism, this feeds into the demise of that safe and just space through decreased pro-environmental consumer choices, private adaptation to environmental hazards at the expense of consensual mitigation, deregulation of economy, decreased cooperation in international policy, and the demise of this system of environmental ceiling and social foundation in turn feeds back into that highly egoic self-construct and through decreased attitudes of nature connectedness, scarcity of nature leading to poor mental health, and resource scarcity and environmental hazards, prompting reduced between group cooperation. There is so much to say about these 7 points. I hope you will give some thought to this, and I hope that you will turn to the peer-reviewed literature on these issues. This article by Oliver et al. In Lancet Planetary Health has a starting point in its literature cited section for you to investigate. I'd like to leave you with the heartwarming story of Greg Taylor, who announced that he will quit drinking by 2050. A Sydney man has set an ambitious target to phase out his alcohol consumption within the next 28 years as part of an impressive plan to improve his health. The program will see Greg, who's 73, continue to drink as normal before reducing consumption in 2049 when he turns 101. Taylor said it was important not to rush the process. It's not realistic to transition to zero alcohol overnight. This requires a phased approach. He said, adding that whiskey drinkers are the real problem. Greg is lobbying for additional investments in beer to maintain beer supply chain security. Greg will be able to bring forward drinking credits earned from days he hasn't drunk over the past 40 years, enabling him to reach net zero but keep drinking. To assist with the transition, he has bought a second beer fridge, which he describes as capture and storage. He is also investing in direct alcohol extraction from the blood. Perhaps this is a ridiculous metaphor, but it really does ring true with me in terms of how we're approaching carbon emissions and the climate system. Here are the courses I'll be teaching this coming spring: Climate Change and Human Systems, One Health, Global Change, Ecology, and Sustainability. And in the fall, my flagship course, Climate Change Biology, which is online, and Global Change, Ecology, and Sustainability again. Thank you all. I hope this has been a productive and instructive semester. I hope you've gotten to know each other, and I hope that you appreciate some of the challenges we're facing. I hope I've helped give you some solutions, and I want you to know I'm grateful for educating me. You can reach me at smulkey@ufl.edu, even though the courses are now ending for the fall semester 2022. I remain open to your questions, comments, suggestions. Please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you. So, I hope you found this useful, and I'll be posting this. Today is the 5th of December. I'll be posting this later this evening. Please finish up your assignments and feel free to contact me with your questions, comments, concerns. I'm here to be of service if I can. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.